couple weeks ago, I uploaded a video called I Tried Wildlife Photography for 2 weeks, in which I told you the story about my recent trip to Botswana with my dad, my brother and sister, and Melly. So in case you don't know about that trip yet and you want to hear the backstory, I'd recommend watching that video first, because in this video I want to continue with a series of film photography I shot in Botswana. I had a couple rolls of film with me to document pretty much anything, especially everything apart from the animals because I was already focusing on them with the digital camera. I had a few rolls of Kodak Gold with me and one roll of Kodak Ektar, and the photos I'm about to show you are some of my favorite impressions I was able to capture on film. So, I want to start off with this photo here. This was shot on the roll of Kodak Gold, and after this I then shot the roll of Ektar. And I wanted to start off with this here because I think it's a nice introductory shot to a series of photographs from this trip. In this case, it is just showcasing the setup that we were traveling with. We all five were traveling with this car, and in the back you can see there's that silver backspace. Basically, it's a pickup truck with this silver thing built on top on the back, I think. And that was basically just a bunch of storage space. And on the roof, we then had the two tents. So those were foldable and you would just fold them back into their like traveling mode. And then when you get to the camping place you can unfold them and then they'd look like this. That sounded very easy. It did take about 10 to 15 minutes, which still was fairly easy, just didn't want to make it sound like it's done in 30 seconds. And so on some evenings like this one, when the light was looking good and I was just around, I thought it'd be nice to get a couple shots of our camping setup, and this is one of the shots that I think came out really nicely. I love the lighting and how the orange light of the sunset is like coming through the leaves and hitting the trees. If you look at the top of the trees, you can see a lot of changes in lighting. Sadly, on the lower half of the frame, there isn't that much interesting light anymore, but overall it's still fine. We've got some interesting light. Also, I just really like the subject itself here because I think our camping setup here actually looks quite cool. We've got the washing line between the two trees, which just coincidentally fitted there very nicely. And we've got our camping chairs out already in the car, and personally, I just loved that car. I thought it was just so cool. This dirty car with the two tents on it. I always thought it looked like a really cool camping setup, and so I did get quite a lot of shots of this setup, and this is one of the photos that I thought is worth showing. Then let's continue with these two shots, which aren't actually chronologically correct, meaning that this was actually before the previous photo, because as you can probably guess or see, this was during the flight. I believe at this point during the flight we were already above Botswana, and I already told you in the last video from this trip that Botswana has these amazing big puffy clouds, and this was the moment when I first saw this, and we were flying above the country and there were so many beautiful clouds. You can see in the left photo that huge just chunk of fluffy, beautiful, cute clouds. I think clouds are just so fascinating because they look soft and they look squishy, but at the same time it's literally just air. And so yeah, it's this constant fascination for clouds which I think many people share, and I definitely feel that. And so I really enjoy photographing clouds, as you have probably noticed if you've been following this channel for a while, that I do often like to photograph clouds simply for the sake of photographing the clouds because they're beautiful. And so of course, as we were flying here, I felt compelled that I have to get a shot of these sceneries here. So the first one I think is gorgeous because of the very high up wide view of these clouds, because we were still quite far above the clouds, whereas in the second photo you can see this was right before we actually went into the clouds, which also is a cool perspective. But now when comparing the two photos, I think I prefer the left one. Both are really cool in my opinion, simply because I'm a cloud fan, and I think with these photos I can probably convey why I think clouds are so cool. I mean, just look at this. Then next, let's continue with more photos from the car. As I already expressed, I'm just a big fan of this car, and I loved that after like 3 days or so, this car was already so dirty. Of course, it was funny that they gave us a white car for some reason, maybe so that you can see the dirt even better. But we really got dirty, especially on the second day, I think it was, that we went through so many puddles and so much mud. And I got this detail shot, which really intends to just show this door full of this really thick dirt and mud on it. And so now, photographically speaking, the left photo I wanted to include just because I think the light here worked out really well again. I'm not sure if this was at the same time that I got the previous photo of the car, but it could be. Again, we've got beautiful golden hour light, and I tend to forget at times how beautiful golden hour light is and that I should actually more often take advantage of that lighting situation. I do tend to just make use of the lights that I have at any given moment, but actually waiting for golden hour is, well, there is a reason why so many people do it, and here is why. The composition, however, is a bit strange. I don't really know why I cut off the car at the back, which just feels a little off now. I think I probably should have just gone back, but maybe that wasn't possible. Maybe I was standing right by that tree and I couldn't go further back. I'm not sure, but I think the composition here is a little off. On the other hand, in the right photo, I really like the composition. As you can see, something that I don't do so much are these vertical photos. Some people have commented before that it's strange how few vertical photos I do and why I don't do them, but it's just that I really like horizontal photos. But here is an exception, and I think for this purpose it really works very nicely because you get the wheel and it goes up to the car, and the car isn't shown in its complete size here, but I think it's fine. I think this spot where I cut it off feels quite natural, and you've got focus on the wheel, the dirt, and a little bit on that mirror. And I think even though the light was a bit random at this moment, it actually looks really nice. Then let's continue with these two photos, which I would count to one of my favorites, definitely very high up on the list. So this was one evening when we were just enjoying the sunset and on a walk, and we came to this bridge. The sun had already dipped down, I think, and this was this post-sunset light when everything's still like orange and reddish, but it's not yet blue hour, it's just in between, like right after sunset. And I loved the reflection of the sky in the water of this river in the left photo. Also, I thought this river in itself was just really beautiful with all of these grasses coming out of the water. And so I tried to combine those two elements in this photograph. And here, I think in one sense, it kind of seems aimless because you're not quite sure what it is that I'm trying to show. But at the same time, everything is shown in the photo that I want to show. I wanted to show the river with the grasses coming out and the beautiful colors and reflections. And so I personally am actually really happy with this photo. I think it really brings across this vibe, especially in combination with the photo on the right. As a pair, they just go together perfectly, I think. But I'd be really interested what you think. Just let me know how you perceive this photo, if it seems a bit random to you. And then on the right photo, this is a photo of my dad, who was just sitting on the edge of the bridge and enjoying the sunset, just looking into the distance. I just loved the lighting, how it comes from the front, but because I'm from the side, we get this not so flat looking, but actually quite dynamic light in the front of his face and then the shade continuing to the back of his head. And also just working with these leading lines, even though it actually, I don't know, in theory it shouldn't really work because the leading lines are leading somewhere into the distance, but our subject is at the front. But I think this composition feels totally fine. It flows very nicely and I know exactly where I want to look. What I appreciate is that my dad is in the middle of this huge arch that is made by the tree behind him. This just feels very natural. So overall, both of these photos, I think what makes them so intriguing for me is the lighting, but also how natural these compositions feel. They don't feel forced, and that often makes them feel a bit weird maybe. But in this case, I think they both feel very natural, like naturally pleasing compositions. Maybe that's a good way to put it, why I feel good about these photos. Then let's continue with these two photos. This is on another day, as you can see, in the middle of the day in bright sunlight. In the photos, it actually always looks so much cloudier than it really was. It looks like it was an overcast day, at least if you look at the sky. You can see some patches of blue, but mostly clouds, but that's not what it felt like. It was really hot. But nevertheless, I do really like them a lot. And the left photo is, again, a car appreciation photo, I suppose. I just, as said, really appreciated the car. I thought this car was just really cool. And here you can see how the tents looked like when we actually put them together again and folded them. I think we had just gotten out for a short moment here to photograph something, and then I just snapped another photo of the car because I thought it's a nice composition here with the field in the foreground, The car sort of hiding but still being very present among all of these grasses, with the bush behind and the sky on top. The sky, as said, has a little bit too much cloud for my taste. I would appreciate if there'd be a little bit more blue there. But yeah, overall, still a very decent photo, I think, even though the composition is so simple. But again, I think this one maybe comes down, again, to it feeling quite natural, and it just feels right to do it like this. Something I've thought about a lot lately is center compositions. I often do that, and often it's not really spoken well of, I think, because, you know, the rule of thirds and stuff. But I do a lot of photos, just like the other photo, actually, the right photo. The zebra is right in the center. It's so simple, and I think simplicity just works so well so often. And so both of these photos, I think, just work the best by just center framing. Some people might call this boring, but I don't know, it just works for me. It feels very natural. Let me know what you think. But for me, these both feel very nice. What I love in the right photo is, of course, the depth that is added by shooting out of the car. So with melee and just the car in the foreground, slightly blurry, and also just framing what we can see outside. And then we've not just got a landscape outside, but actually a subject to look at. I think in that way, this photo also really flows nicely. Then the next two photos are another wonderful cloud appreciation, I suppose, even though the clouds here are definitely not the main subject of the photo, but they're definitely a big part of it. The left photo is another very simple photo of the landscape here. I would say this is a very classic landscape photo, probably. We've basically just got two layers. We've got the bottom half and the top half. And this here is the way that I wanted to see the clouds in the other photo. Here, I think we've got this wonderful mix between a blue, vibrant sky, but also these puffy clouds just flying around. And this is what I was talking about in the other Botswana video when I was praising the clouds, and that the clouds there are so different than here in Austria. I rarely see this kind of cloud situation in Austria, and in Botswana, literally every day they look like this. So yeah, I wanted to get another shot. This one, however, I actually didn't shoot just because of the clouds. Of course, they were a part of it, but actually I just really was fascinated by the landscape, because as you can see here, this was suddenly such a flat landscape. There were just no trees around. I think maybe if you saw the last video, you remember that I also talked about another photo I got on this day. I mentioned there already that this was really intriguing to me, that there are just no trees around. And right in the foreground, we had this waterhole with a bunch of animals, and so I thought, how about getting a photo on Kodak Gold of this situation here? And this is what I got, and I think it's a beautiful outcome. I'm not sure how much of a fan I am of the simplicity in this case, because maybe it's just a wee bit too simple. Maybe it would be more interesting if this would have been with a 50mm lens instead of a 35mm, because I think maybe it's the foreground for me that feels a little empty and boring. Just some thoughts that I had, but overall I do still really like this photograph. And the photo on the right side shows the same day, but later in the day, in the evening, I think just after we had our supper, and I just walked off for a short moment because I saw these beautiful clouds in the wonderful sunset light, and I really wanted to capture the moment. I love the sideway light that is coming from the left and giving us this nice mixture of green and orange tones in the foreground. And then the top half of the photo feels a wee bit empty, especially on the left, but the clouds are of course what are supposed to be the subject in that top half. But yes, the top, especially the left, is a bit empty, so maybe I might crop this photo a bit more in the future if I were to make a final version of the photograph. Then let's continue with another one of my favorite film photos from the whole trip. This here, it's another very simple photo, but I just love how this one turned out. In case you're interested, I believe this photo here is now not shot on Kodak Gold anymore, but on Kodak Ektar. And we were just driving on this road to the next place that we were heading to, and we got to this new terrain again, with this new type of landscape. And it was similar in the way that it was so vast with no trees and so flat, and you could just see so far into the distance. But in the foreground, you'd actually get some trees and also that river. You can barely see it here, but you can see those patches of water. And I was just fascinated by this landscape and the view. You'd have these trees whizzing by. Occasionally, you'd see some little farms or some little houses. And then you'd have the river, and then into the distance, all the way into the far horizon, you'd just see a bunch of empty land. Just nature spreading out into the distance. I really enjoyed this part of the car ride, and of course I had my camera ready to shoot a couple photos, and I really wanted to get this effect that you can see here with the foreground whizzing by in motion blur thanks to a slower shutter, because I thought it'd be really nice to get this mix of parts of the image being blurry due to the motion, but then other parts of the image being fully sharp. So I believe this was maybe at a 250th of a second. We were driving quite fast, so even with the 250 shutter speed you could get quite a lot of motion blur in the foreground. And of course, when shooting these types of photos out of the car, it becomes quite difficult to actually compose precisely, because that tree that you can see there on the left side of the photo, that was not intentional. I was just hoping that it would be right around there. I would see it coming and then try to press the shutter at the right moment so that I get a little bit of foreground and a little bit of the background. And this is just the one photo where it worked perfectly. At least I really love it here, because we get to see the landscape, we get to see the river, but we've also got an interesting foreground, especially that tree on the left. It feels like a connection between the two layers, meaning the sky, the top layer, the blue layer, and then the green layer in the bottom. And I think the line is pretty much centered, it's pretty much in the middle, so it's really half the photo, and that tree feels like a connection of those two, so that they don't feel as separated, which just increases this flow in the photo, I suppose. So I was very pleased when scanning this, and I saw that it all worked out and that the composition here came out pleasingly, even though it was sort of a gamble or just a bit of luck needed, and luckily I got lucky. Then the next two photos are a bit of a change. I want to show you these two, which are, well, vastly different in subject matter, because so far I've shown you a lot of nature, a lot of trees, bushes and rivers, and now this is full of concrete suddenly. So we weren't only in Botswana actually, but we were traveling in the north of Botswana, and that is very close to Namibia and also to Zimbabwe. And so we visited those countries very briefly, but the thing is, every time you enter one of those countries, you have to do all the signing in and stuff. So you have got to give them your name, your passport number and all that stuff. And that is what we were doing when I got these two photos. So you'd always get to the border control place, and that usually be somewhat of a quiet place with a couple buildings, and I always found it quite intriguing because it was a place where the locals weren't usually at. It was really more of a place secluded for government officials and us, tourists, who wanted to cross the border. And so it always had this very strange feeling, the feeling that you get when you see these liminal spaces, as you know, which is also a very popular photography subject because it has this strange atmosphere of solitude or loneliness. And I found it very interesting that I also felt that here, even though we were actually there to see people, but those people were in the building, and in the right photo you can actually see my brother, so it doesn't really feel lonely, but it still sort of feels like, yeah, maybe lonely is the right word, I'm not quite sure. It feels so quiet, or maybe that's just because I experienced it. But I hope that I can somehow convey this feeling in the photos as well. So the left photo is just this entrance to a place where the people parked their cars. But what is interesting here is if you look closely, you can see that that car probably hasn't moved in a while because its tires are broken and flat and ripped apart. So that just increased this feeling of loneliness, I suppose. I just found it quite intriguing, and also the colors I found really pleasing actually. There was a lot of white and pastel orange and yellowish colors, and all of that felt like something worth photographing. And so I got these two photos, and I think they came out beautifully and document exactly what I was trying to document. At least I hope that I can somehow convey that feeling in these photos. You are the one who has to tell me if I actually managed to do that. Next, let's continue with another set of photos from our campsite. Here we had come to another stop where we would stay the night, and on the left photo is just another documentation of our campsite. I think it's a really nice photo that compactly shows everything that we had set up on that day. Here I think in the photograph, just due to the composition, it seems even compacter than it actually was. So basically we just parked next to this tree here. So this is the campsite that we were sent to. And I thought this was beautiful, especially with the lights coming from behind a little bit, already being quite warm, close to sunset. It wasn't quite golden hour yet, but it still looks very pleasing here, I think. And I just really appreciate this photo again for, I suppose it's again this simplicity and how it all flows. And again, as you can see, I went for this very simple center composition, but I think it just works here. I wouldn't know why I would do the composition in any other way here. I also think that the distance worked very well here because we've got a lot of the environment on the outside. We've got the sun coming at the top, which I'm really happy about because it has this beautiful glow. The right photo is a shot of Melly, and now I just recognize that it's not the same campsite. This was a different campsite. I just felt like these photos would fit together very nicely. So this is Melly in the foreground, just picking up the top of the pot, and we were cooking a curry, as you can see, and I think it really looks good in the photo because photographing food is always a bit tricky, I think, to actually make it look good, but here I think it really looks good. And I just love how the colors came out here, except for Melly's hand. Melly's hand kind of turned out really red, which is a bit weird, but the rest of the photo looks gorgeous. And I shot this with the 50mm, which is not a lens that I use that much, but when I use it, I again and again notice this beautiful separation that you get from that lens of foreground and background if you use it in that way. So in this case, I was getting this detail of us camping. It really nicely separates the pot from everything else. So Melly in the foreground naturally comes into the blurriness, and then the background also is pretty blurry, which has a really decent look here. So yeah, I wanted to also show this one to you as a detail shot for a change. Then, to finish off this video, let's end the presentation with this last photo. So this was another campsite, and we were next to this river and there were some boats parked there, and just when the sun was setting, I went on a little walk to find a good angle to photograph those clouds. Again, just look at that huge mountain of clouds. I thought it was beautiful, and it had some beautiful lights from the side shining on it, which sadly doesn't really come out very well in this photo. The highlights in this photo don't really look very good. You can see in the water what the colors actually looked like. It was far more orange, but the actual clouds, maybe it was just too bright and it got overexposed, I'm not sure, but here they somehow came out pretty white, which is such a pity because they were really orange, almost pink, and it was gorgeous. But nevertheless, I think the composition still works very nicely in this photo. I really like how we've got these boats in the foreground and the river, and then this line of, what is that, grass and bushes, I suppose, and then that cloud in the background. Again, there's that spot of the sky that is a bit empty. But apart from that, I think this composition is again very decent, showing a lot of different things that one can look at just to get a feel for the place that we were staying that night. So yeah, that pretty much summarizes my... I think that those were more or less my favorite photos, my favorite film photos from the trip. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you enjoyed seeing what kind of photographs I could get on this trip with film. And there will be probably one more photo covering more digital photos that I got, but I did really want to separate digital and film because I think these two mediums are just so different and it's worth actually making two separate videos. So I hope you enjoyed this analog portion of this video series from Botswana, and with that said, I think it's time for me to sign off for this week, and I'll see you again next week. Until then, goodbye.